morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's Friday. Welcome to Ask the Theologian. Sorry, we're just a few minutes late getting started, but we are here ready to take your biblical, theological, worldview questions, whether you are listening on Vimeo or on YouTube or on Facebook or on Randy White Ministries or on podcast or live or archived, whatever it is, we are glad you're here today. Can I let you know that it would be good for your children and grandchildren to be part of the John Nelson Darby Academy? We would be thrilled to have them maybe in the next semester, because there's such an issue of worldview today that needs to be considered in education, and we would love for you to check out jndarbyacademy.org, where we're going to help your children question the assumptions. Before we get into your questions today, let me show you an introduction that comes from the new Baylor, you've heard that word, right? Former Baptist institution. I say former Baptist institution because they separated themselves out from their Baptist convention in a way, the Baptist General Convention of Texas, back, I suppose it was in the 80s now, maybe it was in the early 90s, and they separated themselves out, didn't dance with the one that brung them, and even the one that brung them went kind of leftist, but they wanted to go even more leftist than that, and they have a seminary today, the Truett Theological Seminary, and this is what they put out, the Baylor Annotated Bible. Here is the introduction to the book of Genesis. It says, the first narration of God-willed beginning is let's stop right there. The first narration of God-willed beginning. That kind of gobbledygook talk should always, for one who questions the assumptions, should always be something that says, I think they're trying to pull the wool over my eyes. What is God-willed beginning? Did God will the beginning? Obviously. But the truth is, God created the beginning. They don't want to say that, and it's going to get worse. The first narration of God-willed beginning is the succinct history of the world. That is, notice they put in quotation mark, history of the world. Now, maybe that is because because it's not the entire history of the world, or maybe it's because they don't even think it's a history. I'm suspicious just at the first line. Now, it then continues, and it says, this distinct history of the world that is presented in Genesis 1 through 11. The narrative intends to be neither scientifically nor historically plausible. Plausible. Did you catch that? Let's look here for just a moment and see. Pardon me, I wasn't signed into my dictionary here, but there we go. Let's see what plausible means. Plausible, here we go. As an adjective, here, that's the obsolete of a person's manner. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to have to do is get to a more modern, because I use the OED. So we want the definition of plausible. Here we go. And it says, of an argument or statement seeming reasonable or probable. Now, with that, let's go back here. It intends to be neither scientifically nor historically plausible, seemingly reasonable or probable. In other words, you people out there, you crazy fundamentalists who actually believe Genesis 1 through 11, what idiots you are. They never meant this to be plausible, scientific, or historically. Well, Dr. Wigglejaw, what did they mean it to be? Let's read about it here. It is rather an act of artistic construal whereby the origin, nature, and ongoing life of the world is linked to the Creator. Seems like something out of a Disney movie, doesn't it? And it's just as made up Goes on to say, in order to generate this narrative, the traditionalists of ancient Israel, stop, time out. That is to say, this narrative was not generated by God, and if you think it is, you're a fool. Rather, it's the ancient traditionalists of Israel that utilized many already extant materials. This didn't come from God. This came from stuff that was already there. Where'd they get it? Already extant materials from cultures older than Israel. They got it from the Gilgamesh epic. They made this up from the Sumerians. That's where they got this stuff. You kooks who actually believe the Bible? What kind of knobhead are you? That's what Baylor University is saying. It's saying if you are a Christian that believes the Bible, you are to be mocked. Now, I personally think, by the way, I don't have a degree from Baylor University. Mine is probably just as bad. But I think I'd probably just send the degree back. It's worthless anyway. And honestly, if you're thinking about going to Baylor University, I would say, why? There's a cheaper university just down the road in College Station, Texas. If you want a secular education, go there. And it's going to be honestly more biblical if you go to Texas A&M University. Just forget about Baylor. It is a royal waste of time. It is not a Baptist university. It is not a Christian university. It is a pagan university in the name of Christ. That's the worst kind of university that you can get. It is a university that honestly, every Baptist, even those of you liberal Baptists of the Baptist General Convention of Texas, you ought to be saying, we will not allow this. Remove the name, change it, call it Devil University, whatever you want to do. Look at this. The traditionalists of ancient Israel utilized many already extant materials from cultures older than Israel. Israel, however, in its borrowing such materials, shaped, interpreted, and organized them in ways that made them into a peculiarly Israelite narrative that attested the God of Israel. They made this stuff up. That's what it says. They made this stuff up. Now, again, this is the Baylor Annotated Study Bible. Here's the page at Baylor Press right here, Baylor Annotated Study Bible, edited by W.H. Bellinger and Todd D. Still. You can get it for $69.95 with a hardcover for $49.95. Timeless, empowering, inspired, true. The Holy Bible that is a fake. It's made up. I just think, so I'm a little animated at it. Well, it's because they are undermining the very foundations of the Christian worldview. And I think, I think that everybody who cares anything about the Bible ought to say, that is so utterly ridiculous that every professor at Baylor University, Truett Theological Seminary, should resign today out of protest. If they're even Christian, do they care anything about the Bible? This is just utter religious liberalism of the style of Harry Emerson Fosdick that we talked about just the other day. And it amazes me that the church doesn't care. Now, maybe it's because Baylor, honestly, is this skeleton of the past, and nobody cares about Baylor. Nobody goes to Baylor because it's a Christian university. They go to Baylor maybe because there's some kind of alumni network, and they think they can get a job from it, or their grandmother went to Baylor or something. That's the only reason anybody goes to Baylor, because it's a lousy school. It's a pitiful excuse of a college that scams you of your money. It's a bigger scam than Trump University if you want to study it. Go to a real college. I mean, I would rather you go to University of Texas than you went to Baylor University, and the University of Texas is liberal, but at least it's cheaper. I mean, save some of your hard-earned money and send us the difference. Randy White Ministries, P.O. Box 3181, Taos, New Mexico, 87571. Now, let's get into your questions today. We'll start with Tony. Last night you connected the saints in the book of Galatians with the angels at the giving of the law. Do you connect the angels in Revelation 2 and 3 with the giving of God's speech to Israel? Now, let's look to Galatians chapter 3. Let's see, what verse was that in? Chapter 3, verse 19 is where we are. And I said, was speaking about the law and the giving of the law. And here at the end of verse 19, the law was ordained by angels, ordained by angels. And from there, I went to, let me see if I can find my notes here on verse 19. I think I've still got them up. There we go. Verse 19, what was the passage in Leviticus, or Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. So we were in Galatians. We saw that it was ordained by angels. I said, how in the world was the law ordained by angels? Ordained, the word we talked about is thoroughly ordered. How was it thoroughly ordered by angels? So Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, the Lord came from Sinai, and down here, he came with 10,000 of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law. Now, here, 10,000 of saints and ordained by angels. Where are we? There we go. Ordained by angels. So, I said the angels of Galatians 3:19 were the 10,000 saints, 10,000s of saints in Deuteronomy 33. And if you follow that through the Old Testament, that's angels. And so it is correct here, ordained by angels or ordered by angels. And I talked about the angels that were implementing or ordering the law among the Jewish people. Now, so you're right. I connected the saints in the book of Galatians, where actually it says the angels in the book of Galatians, with the angels at the giving of the law. So with that then, Tony asked a good question, and the question is, what about the angels in Revelation chapter 2 and 3? If you come to Revelation chapter 2, verse 1, unto the angel of the church at Ephesus write. Now, actually, I don't really associate those here. I think in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, angel there is messenger. I would associate that with the pastor, the human pastor. I think there are some things in Revelation chapter 2 and 3 that don't allow that to be a spiritual being. So not being a spiritual being, it must be obviously a physical being. And who is that? I think it's the pastor. And that particular word, you may remember angel, is one that can be angelic being or it can be human being. In the case of Revelation chapter 2 and 3, I don't think it's an angel invisible watching over, though you could make the argument, and I think you could follow this line of reasoning that Tony is bringing about. I just think when you get into the identity of these angels, if we were to follow through in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, we're going to find that there are some things that are just not very angelic about these angels in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. So I think the angels of 2 and 3 are pastors of future Jewish assemblies that are going to be during the time of the tribulation for that period of time. And so the message of God was given then unto the angel, or is given for that angel to proclaim to his church. I appreciate that. Okay. An advanced question. I heard that Genesis chapter 3 verse 21 was the verse where the Lord sacrificed an animal and gave skins to Adam and Eve. Could it be that there was no sacrifice, but the Lord just created the skins to cover Adam and Eve? Let's go to Genesis chapter 3. Verse 21, and to Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skins and clothed them. Now, very often it is taught that this was the first sacrifice because where do you get the skins from the animals? You kill the animal. And so that the animal died in order to provide a covering for the nakedness of Adam and Eve. Now, this question comes in, questioning the assumptions. Could it be that there was no sacrifice, but the Lord just created skins to cover Adam and Eve? The Lord did make coats of skins. I think the question there becomes that word make. Let's look at this. It is the word, it's not the word, if you were with us yesterday, we talked about the word bara, which is to create out of nothing. This word, if you see it right here, it is to make or to manufacture, if you will. It is to craft, to take something that has been there. So it looks like skins were there and he crafted that out. Now, let's check the word skins here. Skin, hide, or leather. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't something like wool or something that off of the skin, and it happened to be a woolen garment, but it does look like the word at a very brief look at it is that this is leather or hide. I don't know of any way you can take the hide of an animal and not sacrifice the animal. Now, could there be the possibility that he created bara, the skins, and then made the animal? Made the coats. I suppose that it's not totally out of the question. I just don't think that there's anything in the text that would lead us to that kind of a miraculous provision of skins. This looks to me to be God working in the already natural world. So, the question is, could it be there was no sacrifice, but the Lord just created the skins to cover Adam and Eve? I suppose that it could be that grammar does not disallow that, but I think at the same time, grammar doesn't lend itself to that. I would more expect if he did this to have the word bara, that he created coats of skins, or he made coats of created skins, or some indication there. And that indication is not there. Now again, not totally prohibited here, but it would not be the natural reading. And I am a literalist, and a literalist says, I'm going to read this naturally, and if the plain sense makes common sense, seek no other sense. So it seems to me like it is a safe assumption to say the Lord killed some kind of animal and made the provision then of those skins that were added there. Thank you for that question. Renee down in Albuquerque, what constituted the age of adulthood in the Old Testament, where boys were allowed to join up in the forces of wartime? I don't think that the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures has a clear answer for that. I do know that somewhere along the way in Jewish history that the age of 12 became the bar mitzvah. And the bar mitzvah was the time at which a boy was considered a man. Was he then allowed to join up in the forces of wartime? Probably. I doubt that they typically would have used a 12-year-old boy because he wouldn't have been very well equipped. But, probably by 14, 15, 16, he was in there. We take David, the shepherd, who was not in the war with his brothers. And honestly, probably David, because of some of the words that are used in the Scriptures, his youth and whatnot, and it looks like David was probably 12, 13, 14 years old when he killed Goliath, but he was not in the army yet. He he pushed himself into it. They kind of laughed at him, even King Saul, because he couldn't even wear a man's armor. He was still wearing boy size clothing at that time. And so my guess is more for practical reasons they would wait until the boy was a little bit older before they put him in. But I would suppose it was actually fairly young. But in rabbinical history, which this probably goes back to the exile, in rabbinical history, a boy of 12 was considered responsible for Torah. At 12 years old, he had to read the Torah, he had to obey the Torah, he had to do what was in the Torah, and carry that out. Now, again, that's not directly from the pages of Scripture, and I don't know the exact history of it. I do, however, know that when I've studied rabbinical history, they don't just haphazardly come up with something. I don't always agree with their conclusion, but they've always got a well thought out agenda or set of assumptions, which then leads them to this point. So in Judaism, since rabbinical Judaism began, in Judaism, it still to this day, there's no question about when bar mitzvah should be. It's the 12th birthday. No one says, oh, my boy's not quite mature enough. Let's wait till he's 13 or 14 or 15. It is 12 years of age. That is the time that is given there. I want to look and see if, may not find anything here. And I don't see anything. Let me just tell you what I was doing here. When I have a Jewish question like that, a Jewish history question, I tend to go to Chabad.org or Chabad, if you're trying to spell it phonetically, Chabad.org. And I put, why is bar mitzvah at 12? It brought up this one thing. We'd have to look in there to see if it was, if it's even in there. But we may even be able to, and I could be spelling it here, bar mitzvah. There we go. What's the deeper significance behind the Jewish adolescence rite of passage? When is it? How to celebrate it? The laws of bar mitzvah. Probably we could look through here and see what's involved through there, and find out some history at Chabad.org, and try to figure out how they got it from the Old Testament. But to your question, what constituted the age of adulthood in the Old Testament? I don't think it's there. I don't think the Old Testament is clear on that. I think the Jewish people later came up with a clarity on that. I think they probably had some path that led them there. I just don't know what it is. Sorry about that, Renee. I appreciate that. And the question through there. Anthony on YouTube has a question for us. I have another question regarding John chapter 3. Last week, you mentioned that verse 6 was not spoken by Jesus, but was added by commentary. I think that should be verse 16, actually. That verse 16 was not spoken by Jesus, but was added commentary. How would you, excuse me, how would you understand verses 14 and 15? Are they spoken by Jesus? Let's go to John 3, verse 14. And actually, I want to go, let's start with verse 12. John chapter 3, verse 12. If I have told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? Now here, that's clearly Jesus speaking. The pronoun gives it in the earlier context, tells us this is Jesus speaking. Now, I think that at verse 13 is where we begin to have to question. It goes on, if I tell you of heavenly things, and no man hath ascended up to the heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven. Now, what we want to know here is now that he is not saying I, but he is referring to the Son of Man in the third person. Does that mean that Jesus is not now speaking? It certainly means that we can question whether Jesus is speaking. I don't think you can question it in verse 12, but verse 13, in verse 12 it's I, in verse 13, and the Son of Man. So maybe this is John that comes in and says, no man hath ascended up into heaven, but he, third person, that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven. Now, that first of all, if I'm suspecting John, and you have to start out suspecting something probably, if I'm suspecting John wrote this as commentary, it makes sense that he's saying, he that came down, the Son of Man, which is in heaven. That's the present tense there, present participle. That is, which is being in heaven. Well, if Jesus is right on earth talking these words to Nicodemus, then he's not in heaven. He's already come down. So why doesn't it, even if he wants to talk in third person, why doesn't he say, he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which was in heaven and shall return to heaven? It looks to me like commentary is beginning here by John. Again, not totally proven here, but it looks like it. Now, the thing that works against that, to say, no, I think this is Jesus, is this word and right here. That if I tell you heavenly things, and that's a conjunction word, as it says at the bottom of your screen there, a logical connective. Again, that doesn't have to be Jesus. John could come in with his commentary and say, and no man hath ascended. And that can work, but and tends to say, let me tell you this and this. So a little bit questionable here. Let's go on and see if we find out anything else as we go into 14. 14 and 15 is what you are referring to in the question. And we've got the same here, that logical connective, that conjunction, and pulling this together. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Now here, it is given to us in the future tense, but I would remind you, as I have many, many times, that the Greek doesn't have the future tense. It's just at a point in time. So that, again, doesn't help us. It could be Jesus saying he must be lifted up, or it could be John decades later saying he must be lifted up. You would use the same tense, so we're not given an answer there. So I think whatever you take on 13 is going to lead into 14. And then you come into 15, he must be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him. And here we have a present active participle. We might say whosoever is believing in him. I believe if we go to the Young's, everyone who is believing in him should not perish but have eternal life. Now, I don't think that those, in verse 15, I don't think that those are words that Jesus could have spoken to Nicodemus, because Nicodemus was not in a day in which, if you were just believing on him, you had eternal life. That kind of salvation had not been given, because that was based upon the completed work of Jesus Christ, and the completed work of Jesus Christ hadn't happened. That leads me to say we have a theological problem with verse 15 being spoken to Nicodemus, and of course going on into verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believeth, present active participle, whosoever, again, is believing presently, right now, whosoever is believing in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I think verse 16, verse 15, that leads then back into 14 and 13, all being commentary by John, and thus should not be in red letters, but should be in black letters. After our discussion the other day, by the way, I believe it was Imogene sent me a question and asked about the Schofield Bible, whether or not it was available in black letter print. It is, but not through a regular publisher. And therefore I can't get it and sell it. One of these days, we, Dispensational Publishing, will take the text of the Schofield, which is in the public domain now, so anyone can print it. We will take that and put it all together. Obviously, the King James Version also in the public domain, and we will take that and put it, and I would prefer a black letter edition, honestly, because it makes you study and do that. But, yes, Anthony did correct later on, not verse 6, but verse 16, as I suspected. So I think that, again, verse 12 has to be Jesus. Verse 13, the word "and" makes us think we're continuing on with Jesus, but if we were to study that in John's usage of that, I think we would find that it doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus has to continue. So I don't think that's boxing us in there. And then immediately in verse 13, he goes to the third person, he that came down at a point in time, even the Son of Man, which is, this is the present participle. So as he's writing, this is not the point in time, this is as he is writing, presently he is in heaven. Again, Jesus was not in heaven, so it wouldn't make any sense to be, that would make Jesus not being the Son of Man. The Son of Man which is in heaven, and I'm right here. So I think beginning in verse 13, we really do have to have it be commentary given by John. Thank you, Anthony. Pastor Rick, I have heard some say that Jonathan Edwards was America's most important theologian and philosopher. What do you think of Jonathan Edwards? Someone to read after and learn from? Probably not. Jonathan Edwards obviously was a very influential theologian and philosopher and preacher. He was a Presbyterian. He was the president of Yale, I believe, wasn't it? Or Princeton. One of those Ivy League colleges that he was the president of. He was steeped in Reformed theology and Calvinism. And so I think that everything he brings forth is going to be Calvinistic, Puritanistic kind of theology. And while I appreciate the heritage and the blessing that the Puritans brought to the United States, and in so many ways shaped who the United States is, I think that one of the reasons that Canada in its culture has been so different than the United States is because the United States was so influenced by Puritanism, and Canada was not. But through that, I would only read Jonathan Edwards if I wanted to study the history of philosophical religious thought in the early American days. So I would study him historically. I don't think I would spend the time reading and learning from him theologically, because I think his theology is flawed. If I wanted a history of Christian thought in America, or a history of Calvinism in America, he'd be a great person to go to. But I think that his worldview is going to be so tainted by the overarching doctrine of original sin that is held by Reformed theology, which is why we're sinners in the hands of an angry God, to use his most famous sermon title, that it's going to skew our theology. And I'd rather we get our theology from the Bible than Jonathan Edwards, honestly. Again, someone to read after and learn from, I think only if you're doing it for historical study. It would be interesting, but I wouldn't do it for theological study. Also from Pastor Rick, do you believe the correct interpretation of Genesis 10:18 through 27 is that Ham did something immoral to his father upon seeing his nakedness? Other interpretations that you have heard. Not the easiest passage of Scripture. Genesis 10, beginning in verse 18. Let's read through here. That it says, and the Arvadite and the Zemanite and the Hamathite, and afterwards were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad, and the border of the Canaanites was Sidon, and goes on through these various things. In verse 20 then, these are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries and their nations, unto Shem also. Now, in Genesis 9, let's see, you're probably referring to Genesis 9:18, though that has some insight in chapter 10. But in 9, after the sons of Noah that went forth from the ark, and the sons of Noah that went from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the Ham is the father of Canaan. Now, this phrase right here has always intrigued me. It says, the sons of Noah that went forth from the ark are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Oh, and Ham is the father of Canaan. We're talking about people who went forth from the ark, which causes me to think, and the text does not totally answer this question. Was Canaan born on the ark? There certainly was enough time for it to happen. Was he born on the ark? If he was born on the ark, was he conceived on the ark? Or was Ham's wife, Mrs. Piggy, was she already pregnant when the door of the ark was shut? My best presumption, by the way, is that Ham's wife was pregnant with Canaan prior to getting on the ark, and Canaan was born on the ark. And it is my conjecture, maybe, that Canaan was Nephilim, that Ham was not the father of Canaan. Therefore, the curse did not come upon Ham, but it came upon Canaan. And if you go back to Genesis 10, where we were, and look through the Hamites, the descendants of Ham were not eradicated from the earth, but the descendants of Canaan were eradicated from the earth by the instruction of God. Furthermore, we have earlier in Genesis chapter 6, it says that there were these giants in the land, or Nephilim, if you want to use the Hebrew word, in the land in those days before the ark. And it says, and afterward. Well, how'd they get there afterward? A couple of different possibilities, but I think this is how they got there afterward. And Canaan being the only one, he's the only Nephilim. Now, Canaan is going to have to marry a human wife, and the way DNA works is this Nephilim DNA is going to lose its strength over time. And because of that, we're going to see the Nephilim not be as giant as before. But later on, we're going to see men like Goliath, who is a Philistine, and the Philistines are descendants of the Canaanites. And in addition, all of those Hittites, Perizzites, termites, all those kind of things, they came from Canaan. And so my interpretation of this is that something happened with Ham, but what we really want to pull out of that story is that Canaan is the suspicious one, and Canaan is the cursed one. Ham, and this was, I think, some bad theology back in the days of the Civil War. Some people say, well, you know, the curse was blackness, and the black race is cursed because they're descendants of Ham. And yet Ham was not cursed. It's the Canaanites. And the Canaanites were not black, by the way. In fact, nobody was black just there immediately after the ark. But that was not, the blackness, black skin was not the curse of Canaan. Doesn't even fit, honestly. But you go on, these then are the sons of Noah. I was with them, and they spread of the whole earth. Noah began to be a husbandman. This is obviously sometime later. Planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine, was drunken, and he was uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, once again, it brings that out, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it upon their shoulders, went backwards, covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. Honestly, I've got some information about this in our series on the flood, the saving flood, it's called. But you know, my real question here would be, if I may, why not just let him sleep off his drunkenness naked in his tent? Surely he'd been naked in his tent before, right? So I don't totally understand the story. There is clearly something to the story. And if you, again, on our website, if you go to the Saving Flood, and it is probably going to be, let's see here, maybe session 6, possibly Noah's sin right here. And I've got, why were stories like this included in the Bible? A couple of passages I'll speak to there. What can we learn from this episode of Noah's life? We can learn that Scripture is divinely inspired. See if I can bring that up. Scripture is divinely inspired to faithfully display all of the human experience and nature, that humanity at its best is still depraved. Each dispensation, except with the first and last, begins with a failure, which is the opposite of hope of the dispensation. And I go through some information there. Wine is introduced in the Scripture as a dangerous drink associated with drunkenness, shame, and curse. And we never outgrow temptation. And then there's some of the words here that relate to this prophecy. These words are far more than utterances of a disgusted man towards his sons. They are a prophecy that would be fulfilled in the generations that followed. Ham's sin was a sin of mocking his father. The reluctant curse was rightly a curse on Ham's son, Canaan. The curse of the son was one of servanthood, and goes through then Shem and Japheth and the history of the world. So he put a curse on the son because his son had carried it out. I don't get into, unless I do briefly, I don't get into the whole Nephilim line in that particular passage. But there appears to be some kind of a mocking of the father that took place there. And probably that's what we're dealing with there. Did Ham do something immoral? He did something that his father didn't like. I think that the Bible is blunt enough that had there been something immoral, it would have been brought up. I think that nakedness, earlier on in Genesis, and the covering of with the animal skins, as we have seen, carried the idea of that original sin, or the reminder of Adam's original sin, carried that through, and so maybe a mockery of that in some way. I think it's probably more mockery than anything else through all of that. Thank you very much. Let's see. I'm just picking up a comment that I don't have the full context to, but Tara does have a good comment here. It's sad that simple coloring on a page has created an entire doctrinal issue. Here, referring in the context, I'm sure, referring to the red letters and the black letters. And it's true that sometimes we read more of the coloring on the page than we do the words themselves. And we interpret based upon the coloring of the page. Now, what would be interesting in this regard is to go back prior to 1900 when the coloring on the page came about and to see, could we find any kind of commentaries before 1900 which are saying Jesus stopped speaking at verse 12, beginning in verse 13. There's lots of commentaries on there, so we may be able to find something about it. And it would be very enlightening to see if it's only since 1900 that these words have so often been attributed to Jesus. Now, we may have to, go back a little further, because my guess is the fellow that did it in 1900 was influenced by the theology of his day as well. Pastor Bob up in Massachusetts should know about Jonathan Edwards and has a good comment here. Edwards pointed out sin, but never gave the solution of sin, the gospel. He preached law through and through. I think you're exactly right, which was Puritanism and Reformed theology is law through and through, over and over. And I saw actually just a comment here. I'm not sure that I can find it. It was on Facebook that someone else wrote, and I don't remember exactly where it was. But it was this same idea of law through and through, bringing in the law. You got to have the law first. And Edwards in that Reformed theology position was basically that you got to come to the mourner's bench. You got to feel so terrible because you've broken all these laws, and just misses the whole assumption, the whole foundation even, that we're not under the law. Thank you, Pastor Bob in Massachusetts. We have Anthony, another question. I promise not to continue asking about the subject. Well, that's what we're here for. We don't charge extra for more questions. Thanks for your help. But I must ask, John 6:40, was that spoken by Jesus? If so, how should, I lost my place. Let's see. There we go. If so, how should this, John 6:40, spoken to Jews, be understood dispensationally? Let's just call that, how should we interpret John chapter 6, verse 40? Spoken by Jesus, what do we have here? And this is the will of him that sent me, that everyone which seeth the Son and believeth on him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up on the last day. I think here we have a number of indications that this indeed is spoken by Jesus. Now, the one thing that we might say leads us against that view is that everyone who believeth on him. And this, again, is, in its plainest sense at least, referring to believeth on the Son. He does have a little third person discussion right here of the one that believeth on him. But in the context, this is the Father's will, that I should lose nothing. I should raise it up again on the last day. This is the will of him, the Father that sent me, that everyone that seeth the Son and believeth on him. He's speaking really from the Father's perspective here, but I think it is Jesus, may have everlasting life. And I will raise him up. Jesus Christ will raise him up on the last day. Now, I think, first of all, you do have a very good point that Jesus here is speaking about believing on him and everlasting life. And these are the words of Jesus. Now, in the context of John chapter 6, and let me again just leave a little teaser out here that I'm getting close to starting a series through the Gospel of John and really dealing with the book as a whole, which kind of like Acts is going to take us a while, but we'll get there. But in the context of John chapter 6, Jesus is saying, looks like I'm going to lose Israel. Don't worry, I'm not going to lose Israel. I'm going to raise up Israel on the last day. But through all of that, he says, Israel's got some problems. Israel's got some punishment. There's problems ahead for Israel. And it's almost like somebody raises their hand and say, hey, but I'm not going with Israel. I am trusting in you. And Jesus says, you got nothing to worry about. Can I remind you, we'll come back here to John chapter 6, but in John chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, he came unto his own received him not, but as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. Now, let's back up and go back to John 6:40. So the one that does believe on him may have eternal life. I will raise him up on the last day. So this is to the one who is saying, I'm not rejecting you. I understand the nation is rejecting you, but I'm not rejecting you. Well, after his death, burial, and resurrection, and John 6 is 1 year prior to that, after his death, burial, and resurrection, indeed, that was offered, and he gave them the ability. And if they were believing him, even prior to the resurrection, certainly they were believing him after the resurrection, when you've got even more evidence, and he will raise them up on the last day. Not, by the way, in the rapture, which is not the last day, but in the resurrection of the Jews. My friend David Reed, Pastor David Reed in Columbus, Ohio, had a sermon that someone posted just the other day on whether or not these Jewish saints went to heaven at the crucifixion. And like this guy, whether or not they're part of the rapture. He says, no, this is exclusively a Pauline kind of thing. These people here are not Pauline, so they are going to be raised up on the last day. They are with Israel through it all. Now, one of the things that I would note here, everyone that seeth the Son. You say, well, how do we do this dispensationally? Dispensationally, this verse is written to everyone which seeth the Son. And the question here is, can you, trying to pull up here something, see if it will help us just a little bit. Have you and I seen the Son? I'm talking about S-O-N, and with our eyes, have we seen him? Truth is no. Maybe with our spiritual eyes we have seen him, but we have not seen him in the manner, let's see, here's Strong's Concordance. We are at word 2334 here. 2334 denotes a careful observation of details, whereas 2300 denotes only perception. Now, we have perceived the Son, if you will, but he's talking about the one who has been able to open his eyes and follow and watch Jesus and believed him. So dispensationally, this is only relevant to those who were living in his day, observing what he carried out. Thank you, Anthony. Tara asked, could Ham's wife had just been of the corrupt lineage, so that she was half DNA of the Nephilim, so some of Ham's kids could have a portion of Nephilim, but not all of them. You know, that I think that scientifically that would have to be true. You're right, that maybe it was not that Ham's wife was impregnated by one of the Nephilim, but maybe, down the line somewhere, because this has been happening for some time now, that the Nephilim had come, the sons of God found daughters of men. So that's a good point, that Ham perhaps married one who was infected by this tainted DNA. And and therefore their later children could have brought that about. I thank you for pointing out basic biology for us to understand that. But thank you. And I think I answered this, but just in case I didn't, the reiteration Anthony asked, John 6:40 spoken by Jesus. I think so. I think it was spoken by Jesus. Okay, Fred in Tulsa, comment, the Father's nakedness was Noah's wife. So the question is, did Ham have sex with Noah's wife, his mother? Again, I probably would look into that to see, can we prove that the father's nakedness is actually a reference to the wife there, and in that case it would be a Hebraism, and we might call it a euphemism, a more Victorian manner of speaking. I haven't taken that point of view, but it's worthy of looking into to see if it's possible to bring about that point of view. And maybe grammatically it is through all of that. I appreciate that. Michael has a question, and then we'll conclude here because of time. Could the alien abductions be a continuation of Genesis 6? There is nothing that prohibits Nephilim being in existence today. I don't particularly think they are. I think that we eradicated all of them in, Haman and his children and whatnot. I'll at least say that the sons of Haman were the last true evidence we had of the Nephilim. But, you can go down the road here from where we live and find the grave of Billy the Kid, and you can talk to everyone's grandparents and great-grandparents around here, and they'll tell you they hung out with Billy the Kid after he was buried. So, was Billy the Kid really shot by the sheriff in Fort Sumner, New Mexico? Or did he continue living in New Mexico, in Old Mexico, which was named after New Mexico? Check out your history. And, what's the case there with the Nephilim? So I would agree probably, though it's not my area of expertise, but the book Alien Intrusion, and there's also a movie about that. We should carry it on dispensational publishing, and we have not done so far, but if you want it, we can get it for you. Looks like alienintrusion.com is more for the movie here. Creation Ministries International, creation.com put it out. Get it on DVD, download available right there. That again is for the movie, which is a documentary style. There is the book, Alien Intrusion, also. That you might want to look at if you're, I know the author mildly. I've had him speak in my church before. He takes at least a demonic approach, which would be the same as the Nephilim. I appreciate that. Well, we are out of time. I thank you for being with us here. Hopefully I got all those questions today, and delighted that you have been here with us. And we will be back Sunday, 9:45 for our Bible study, 11:15 for the sermon. Both of those are Mountain Time. Look forward to seeing you again. Hope you had a delightful weekend. Again, there is, if you missed us last night, let me just say that if you will go to our website, and it may look a little different after this broadcast is over, but look for the podcasting tab right there. If it happens not to be there, refresh your screen. It will come up. And you can learn all about how to podcast all of our books of the Bible, all of our if you just want to podcast Ask the Theologian every day, just scroll down a little bit right there. You can do that. We've also got lots of topical, like the 30 Things series. But if you just click that purple little podcast button right there, for example, it will allow you to subscribe to the podcast, and you can do it on however you like to do your podcast. Apple and Google probably the most popular. And for example, just click, here's the Apple podcast that comes up right here, and you can even just play them on your computer, just have the stream there. Thanks for the 5-star reviews. Please review us while you're there. Excuse me, and if you're on your phone, then you can easily just click subscribe, and we're putting up a series of videos. Only have it for iPhone so far. On that podcasting page, you can play this little video right here that shows you how to do it on your iPhone. It's going to be similar on your Androids as well, and be able to take it with you as you go on podcasting. And I might just add one more thing. If you just happen to be on a series like, I don't know, let's pick the parables of Jesus. And if you are on it and you want to podcast that, there is also a podcast button, just particularly will take you straight to that. Or you can go on your phone and do the podcast button and search for Dr. Randy White or Randy White Ministries or RWM, and it'll get you there. Lots and lots of broadcast there. You'll have something to listen to all the way to Taos, New Mexico on your drive. Look forward to seeing you. And if I don't see you in person, then I'll see you online this Sunday morning, 9:45. You just keep questioning the assumptions. God bless you. Randy at randywhiteministries.org. Appreciate all that you do, your encouragements, your prayers, and your financial support. We'll see you soon. God bless you.